Okay, so to get you started today, your lesson today is going to cover a few different due process court cases. Some of these are court cases that you will know. Some of these are court cases you've never heard of. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to give you a quick recap of what each one is. And then for your lesson today, you're going to choose one of these court cases and use the links in the section for the mini lesson to read a little bit more about the cases and really try and understand how they were examples of due process. So, the first thing, what is due process? So, due process is the legal requirement that states must respect all legal rights that are owed to a person. Due process balances the power of law and the land and protects the individual from it. Essentially, due process just means that it is your protection from your government treating you poorly, meaning your government is not giving you the rights that you are owed according to the Constitution, and this is how it will protect you. So things that protect you, the Fifth Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and one thing to kind of think through are those Miranda rights that were in yesterday's lesson. That is someone reading you your rights as a U.S. citizen. So it's important to know what these things are so that you know how the government should be treating you. So here are the court cases you're going to choose from for today. The first one is Brown versus the Board of Education. So you should probably be pretty familiar with Brown versus the Board. 1954, the court rules that segregation in schools was unconstitutional and violated the 14th Amendment rights of minority groups in the United States. As you read about this court case, pay attention to why it violated people's 14th Amendment rights. There are reasons that the court gave for proving that this segregation of schools was not separate but equal. So that's your first option, Brown versus the Board. That's going to be the one you have the most background knowledge on, so it's going to be a good option. Browder versus Gale in 1956. So we spent a long time talking about the Montgomery bus boycott. Browder versus Gale in 1956 is actually the court case that rules that segregation on buses is unconstitutional. This is actually a really interesting one because it talks a lot more about people other than Rosa Parks. Yes, we focus on Rosa Parks. She was a activist who was a major role in the 1950s Montgomery bus boycott. However, Browder versus Gale calls more people, more women who had been mistreated by bus drivers in the city of Montgomery during the time, and is actually the court case that is successful in outlawing bus segregation due to its violation of 14th Amendment rights. There will be some cameos by Thurgood Marshall in this one as well. So you'll have some people that you're familiar with, but this is actually what the Montgomery bus boycott caused. Okay. The next one, and this is an interesting one. This is Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963. In this court case, the court ruled that people, regardless of their income, have a right to an attorney in a trial. If you think about your Miranda rights, right? You have a right to remain silent. Everything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one will be provided for you. Well, in this case, Clarence Gideon was a poor man who was accused of a crime, and the state refused to provide him an attorney. So this court case is actually really interesting because Clarence Gideon was found guilty of his crime because he had no representation. So this is the way that the court kind of came back, and they were like, wait a second, this isn't fair. You have to have an attorney at a trial. That is a right given to you in the Constitution. Okay. Loving versus Virginia, 1967. This is a really interesting case to read about. Basically, Loving is the last name of this couple that you see here on the left. In the 1960s, up until 1967, it was illegal for people of different races to marry. That is what we call interracial marriage. And in 1967, because of these two people right here, in the case called Loving versus Virginia, the court ruled that states could no longer ban interracial marriage, as marriage is a constitutional right protected by the 14th Amendment. This is a really interesting court case. Also, 1967 was not very long ago. It's a really interesting case to read about. It kind of makes you feel, good inside, power of love. It's gonna, it's gonna come through, but it required a Supreme Court decision. So Loving versus Virginia, 1967. It's definitely an interesting one to read about. And the last one that you are going to have the option to read about is actually a pretty controversial one. This is the Regents of the University of California versus Bakke in 1978. So the man on the left is Alan Bakke. This court case goes into something called affirmative action, which basically means that there were affirmative action laws created as a result of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that were essentially trying to protect the availability of things like education and resources and jobs for minority groups. And the way that the University of California was doing that was with a very strict race quota, meaning that of 100 people who are going to be admitted to the University of California's medical school, I can't remember if it was 14 or 16. 14 or 16 of those had to be people of minority groups. Well, Alan Bakke claimed that he was denied because he was weeded out by the race quota, basically saying that if he weren't white, he would have been admitted, and that because he was white, he was not given a fair shot because they were reserving a certain number of seats for people of minority groups. This case is extremely controversial. In the 1960s, 1970s, and even today, minority groups face a lack of equality in access to opportunity. The court actually ruled that the race-based quota for admission was unconstitutional because in this case, Alan Bakke was claiming he was discriminated against for his race, which in this case was because he was white. It is very, very interesting to read about. I would love it if you choose to do this one. I would love to hear your opinion on this court case. It went back and forth quite a few times between it being overruled and then it being supported, and then it kept going back and forth. Eventually, the court does rule that race quotas are unconstitutional. The impact of that was not necessarily as clear-cut. So these are your options for today. You are going to choose one of these court cases to read about, to watch any of the resources that are provided to you in order to help you with today's activity. It's really important not just to know what due process is, but to kind of see it in action because it might help you in the future. Social studies is an important thing, not because it's about a bunch of old dead people, but because it sets the way for the rights that you have as a citizen and the things that you should have that are protected. So I hope you pick one that you're interested in, and then take your time with your activity at the bottom. Let your teachers know if you have any questions at all. Good luck today, guys.